Good evening. This is Elliot Chodoff, speaking now from the DC area. Just came in from Israel a few days ago. I'll be talking tonight about what's happening in Syria in particular, but what I'm going to be talking about as well is how we got into the merry mess that we're in that country. If you've been following the news, you know that somebody, nobody's really admitting to whom, but we can guess who we are, struck a Syrian chemical weapons research and storage facility last night. And I think we can start from there because the strike itself had a number of purposes. One was certainly to take out Syrian chemical capabilities, especially since Syria and Iran, the backer, and really the director of what's going on there, are transferring weapons, including attempting to transfer chemical weapons to Hizbullah. But the timing and the targeting were very much part of sending a message to Iran, but also to Russia, that when Israel draws red lines, and particularly in Syria, unlike other countries, Israel means it. Recently, Prime Minister Netanyahu met with President Putin of Russia, and the Russians, after that meeting, made a particular point of saying that Netanyahu came to Russia with requests and basically begged Russia to intervene on Israel's behalf against Hizbullah and against Iran, and that Putin turned him down flat, basically sent him back to Israel with nothing. And what happened in Syria last night was, in large part, a message back to the Russians and to the Iranians that if you're not going to deal with it, we're going to deal with it. Also, while this is happening, and I think this is also part of the timing, the IDF, the Israeli military, is running one of the largest exercises it's ever run along the northern border in Northern Command. It's not a secret. I don't give away secrets. But it's been in the news, and it's being publicized, and its scale is being publicized also to send a message. It's an exercise that's going to be going on until next Thursday. It's a 10-day long exercise from the command down to the operational level, and explicitly to deal with what's going on in Syria and Lebanon with Hizbullah. Part of the issue here as well, and I want to talk a little bit about what's happening today, but then sort of go back and see how we got to where we got. Part of the issue here as well is that, in addition to outsiders like the Russians being involved and the Iranians, Israel has tried for decades to get the international community involved and to try to put a break on Syrian, Hizbullah, and Iranian preparations to go to war with Israel. Since the early 1980s, there's been a UN force along the Israeli border in Lebanon called UNIFIL, the United Nations Interim Forces in Lebanon. It's kind of interesting that basically since the late 1970s, there's been an interim force in Lebanon to try to keep that border quiet, and it's failed totally and miserably. But that United Nations force was bolstered after the war in 2006 against Hizbullah, and one of its mandates, one of its missions, was to, and still is, to prevent Hizbullah from arming itself, rearming itself, building up arms along the Israeli border. To say that it's failed miserably is to give it too much credit. Hizbullah isn't smuggling weapons into the south, it's shipping them into Lebanon and into South Lebanon. And the Iranians today have actually stepped up in the last few months, and they're actually building weapons factories in Lebanon so they don't have to build the weapons in Iran and ship them in. Also, as I'm sure you know, Syria was supposed to have disarmed its chemical weapons capability, here again under UN auspices and direction. Something that happened a few years ago when, after they used chemical weapons, the American administration drew an absolute red line, which kind of disappeared along the way. And the Syrians, with Russian sort of support, said they would give up their chemical weapons. Now, it's interesting, after the UN and the United States and the Russians declared that Syria had no more chemical weapons, they started using them against their own population, and apparently numerous times. So American guarantees, UN guarantees, Russian guarantees are really not doing it very well for Israeli security. And that leaves us, as always, with having to do it ourselves. To understand where we are today in Syria, we have to sort of go back. And I think a good place to start is the Iranian Revolution of 1979, because that, while at the time wasn't fully recognized in terms of its impact and its import, really puts us on the track to where we are today in the Middle East. When Khomeini came to power, one of the things that he set for himself was to move into and gain control in the critical Middle East. Now, the Iranians have a problem in the Middle East, and that is that they're not Arabs. The Iranians are Persians, and as outsiders, it's interesting because in the West and in the United States in particular, commentators talk about the Middle East and that Iran is part of the Middle East. Iran is not part of the Middle East, it's an outsider. One of their ways to gain a foothold in the Middle East was to play the Shiite Muslim card, since they couldn't play the Arab card. It's here again something that becomes important in understanding where they are relative to others. Saddam Hussein of Iraq was an Arab. The Assad family are Arabs. The Egyptians are Arabs. They're insiders in the Middle East. When they are in conflict over power within the Middle East, they are insiders struggling with each other, competing with each other. The Iranians, and for that matter the Turks, and of course certainly the Russians, are outsiders trying to move in and gain control of a region that doesn't see them as part of itself. So the move was made using Shiite Islam, and this has also led many commentators to sort of overestimate the Sunni Shiite conflict dichotomy in the Middle East, which, while it's there, is really not the core of what's going on. And here, just to give a few examples. The Iranians, where they can't use, or where they don't need to use the Shiite, will simply use the Islamic. The Iranians backed Bosnian Muslims during the campaign there a couple of decades ago. The Bosnians are Sunni for the most part. The Iranians are backing the Taliban in Afghanistan, also Sunnis. They're backing Hamas, which is also Sunni. Where they can use Islam in the grander sense and basically be the banner of Islam, they'll support Sunnis as well. Within the area of Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, it's easier for them to use the Shiite religious and ethnic connection. And with it, they've gained a huge amount of control in Iraq. They have tremendous influence in Syria and moving to control regions there, and through Hizbullah, doing the same thing in Lebanon. Not wanting to have their fingerprint on everything that's going on, they created an agent, and that agent is called Hizbullah. They created it in the early 1980s. They kept it reasonably well hidden for a few years. To this day, you can see literature that says Hizbullah didn't come into existence until the mid-1980s and even mid-late 1980s, when in fact it started in 1980, 1981. But it called itself different names: Islamic Jihad, Popular Resistance Committees. It was all the same people, but they were able to sort of keep the name Hizbullah out of the sort of the banner headlines. But already in the early 1980s, Hizbullah, as an agent of Iran, began operations not only against Israel and the United States, but against other Western targets as well. The purpose of it all was to take on the grand adversary, and the grand adversary is the West, and particularly the United States. And by the way, Khomeini said that very, very clearly from the outset. The war in Syria basically gave Iran the opportunity to make the move that it had been planning for many, many years. There's talk, and you can see it in the reports, and incidentally, even a week ago, even the New York Times had an extensive article on Hizbullah, calling it the enforcer of Iran, which is a pretty good term for it. Talking about what they call the Shiite Crescent, the area through the Middle East that goes from Iran through Syria into Lebanon and up to the Mediterranean coast. And here's where many of the analysts miss the point. The Iranians don't want to get to the Mediterranean coast in order to gain control of the Middle East. They don't need the Mediterranean coast for that. They want to get to the Mediterranean coast, and they're there, and they have bases already on them, naval bases on the Mediterranean coast, in order to be able to get out of the Mediterranean and out to the Atlantic. Because from the Atlantic, they can fight the battle for Europe and ultimately engage the United States of America. Now, if you're sitting there thinking Iran versus the United States, let's not forget we're in a time period where countries like North Korea think they can take on the United States. And by the way, North Korea is part of this sort of combination as well. Just recently, a North Korean ship with chemical weapons was stopped on its way to Syria. A few years ago, somebody, once again, somebody, it's not quite clear whose Air Force it was. Foreign sources say the Israeli Air Force destroyed a Syrian nuclear reactor that was being built using North Korean plans and North Korean components. So what are the North Koreans doing there? Again, they're part of that complex, that mix. I hesitate to use the words axis of evil from the Bush administration, but there is an axis out there, and it is evil. In any event, the Iranian move to the Mediterranean is part of its global strategy, not its regional strategy. And for them, that's critically important. Again, not wanting their fingerprints everywhere, they have this organization, Hizbullah, the enforcer, commonly referred to as Iran's proxy. But they're more than a proxy. A proxy is one who does for themselves, and you benefit from what they do. Hizbullah is Iran's agent. Iran tells them what to do, directs them, and they carry it out. They are the enforcer. Today, operating on every continent, very, very heavily invested in South America, particularly in Venezuela, but not exclusively, and also having infiltrated the United States in very large numbers. They're part of Iran's global reach. To pull it all together, today we're facing the results of decades of letting Iran develop into a regional and potentially global power with a ballistic missile program, with a nuclear weapons program. As a matter of fact, one of Iran's leaders just the other day said, at any time we can go nuclear at any time. So the joint agreement, which wasn't much of an agreement, utterly failed to prevent Iran from moving forward with the nuclear weapons program. They're not violating it, they're just ignoring it. Building an organization like Hizbullah, which to call it a terrorist organization is to underestimate not only its capability, but its scope. It's a terrorist organization, it's also a military organization, a political organization with representatives in the Lebanese parliament and in the cabinet. And with the breakdown of Syria, and not its collapse, but its transformation from essentially a sovereign state to also a client state of Iran, the Iranians are making moves to move their forces, now no longer one step removed through Hizbullah, but their forces themselves, the Revolutionary Guards, to the Israeli border, and ultimately to be able to transport them via the Mediterranean to other parts of the world as well. From Israel, we're looking at a situation where we follow the basic dictum: if they show a gun in the first act, somebody gets killed in the last act. The guns are already there. Iran has supplied Hezbollah with hundreds of thousands of rockets, anti-tank capability, anti-aircraft capability, anti-ship capability, military capability to engage military forces, and we've seen that in Syria. Hezbollah heavily involved not only in the Syrian war, but also in Iraq. And with that, there's good news and bad news. A few thousand of them have been killed. That's good news from our point of view. That means we don't have to engage them. The bad news, though, is that Hezbollah has become an extremely capable military organization with the combat experience they've gained both in Syria and Iraq. And what we're looking at, and what we've learned over the years, not to underestimate them, is not an engagement with a terrorist organization along our northern border, but rather we're looking at a military organization that's been trained, organized, equipped at a very, very high level that can actually present a security threat to the state of Israel. I'm not going to say an invasion threat on the level of the Arab states of the 1970s, but certainly enough to cause massive civilian damage, massive economic damage, massive infrastructure damage that puts Israel in a position that it has to take them seriously on the level of war, as opposed to Hamas, which at least still today is a lower level security threat that can be faced with a campaign and not a full-scale mobilization against them. That's where we are today. The Middle East being the Middle East, predictions are virtually impossible to make. I was in a briefing a couple of years ago in the Army, and the general got up and said, I can guarantee a war won't break out in the next hour. So I'm not even going to make that guarantee, because I'm sitting in the United States, and in the next hour, anything can happen. But we're facing an extremely delicate, dangerous, volatile time, both in Lebanon and Syria today. I'm going to stop here and give you a chance to redirect with questions. So if you'd like to type them in, send them in, I'll be happy to. So far, no questions, I see. That means you're all in shock. Okay, while we're waiting for questions, if they're coming, let me add a few points of what all of this means. Without going into the details, and I won't go into the details of what is being practiced today by the IDF. Here again, not a secret. One of our concerns on a grand scale is that we will no longer be able to fight as we have fought wars over the past couple of decades, which is basically saying that urgency is not that critical. Now, it's a delicate balance. You don't want wars to last a long time. On the other hand, if you have time, you can make decisions carefully, conservatively. You can mobilize in an organized fashion. If it takes another day, it takes another day. Since we're facing now not only a Hizbullah threat, but possibly also an Iranian threat along our second border, one of the things that's being done today and in the exercises is to be able to move very, very quickly. Israel, for those who are familiar with the makeup of the Israeli military, Israel is the only country, the only large-scale country that faces a combat threat that relies heavily on its reserves. Now, the United States has a reserve component, but the reserve component is not the backbone of the military. In Israel, the reserve component is the backbone of the military. And part of what we're doing and practicing is to get that reserve component from civilian to the battlefield very, very quickly. Anybody here who's been to Israel, been to the north, you know that it's a mountainous area. Moving an army through there is challenging, and that's a challenge that's being practiced today. I see a question. Iran pays terrorists to kill Israelis and their families if the terrorist dies. Iran pays terrorists. Unfortunately, today, so does the United States. Terrorists are being paid through their organizations by many different sources and sponsors for many different reasons. Iran does it as a reward. Qatar does it as well. There are certainly other sources, private sources throughout the Arab and the Muslim world who are paying the terrorist organizations to pay the terrorists and their families. But I think it's important to know that the Palestinian Authority, which is funded in part by the United States and also by Europe, pays terrorists to kill Israelis. And if those terrorists are killed, their families get paid. This is one of the major issues that we have today, that murderers of Israelis are being funded essentially from around the world, both from our enemies and unfortunately, somewhat inadvertently, by our friends as well. There's a question, do I think that North Korea and Iran are in league against Israel in the West? I don't think so. I know so. There's no question. Iran and North Korea are allied, at least in the technological sense of weaponry, ballistic missiles. The Iranians are getting it from the North Koreans, not the other way around. They are certainly seeing the results of the North Korean nuclear tests. So there is an agreement, at least on that level. Is it an alliance in the absolute sense? Possibly not. I think it's important to look at things from an historical perspective. In World War II, Germany and Japan had an alliance, but they weren't closely coordinating allies. They had common enemies, and they worked together to a certain extent, but they weren't tightly coordinated. If we think of the American-British alliance of World War II, that was a tightly coordinated alliance. The Germans and the Japanese didn't have that. As a matter of fact, the Germans and the Italians didn't even have that. So I would say that the North Korean-Iranian cooperation alliance is much closer in nature to the German-Japanese one of World War II, where they agree on who the enemy is, they'll help each other out to a certain extent, they'll certainly trade technology and experience, but they don't necessarily have a coordinated operational level, again, that the Western allies had in World War II. Just waiting to see if any other questions are coming up. No more. Okay. So let me conclude by saying this. We are today in an extremely dangerous place, and it's come to the surface over the past 8 months or so with the new American administration. And I want to be very, very clear on this. It isn't caused by the American administration, it's being brought to the surface by the new administration. For over 20 years, the United States has allowed North Korea to basically do whatever it wanted. For longer than that, it's allowed Iran to do whatever it wanted. Russia has begun to move in the last decade or so. No American leader was standing up to them. Terrorist organizations were operating, and the American response was ragged. In other words, in some places against them, in some places not so much. Sort of a poke this way, poke that way. And the new administration is taking much more of a public stance against all of the above. And I think that the person who got it best was Winston Churchill, who said that appeasement is feeding your friends to the crocodiles and hoping they eat you last. I think that when you stop feeding the crocodiles, which is what happens when you stop appeasing them, the crocodiles get kind of upset. And what we're seeing now is a bunch of upset crocodiles in that list that I mentioned before. The result is that we're going to be tested. And now we're going to have to stand and face the test. So, a question about the tunnels. The tunnels were certainly an issue during Operation Protective Edge in Gaza. We operate on the assumption that there are tunnels under the Lebanese border as well. Tunnels weren't created recently by the terrorists. For those who are familiar with the Korean situation, the North Koreans have tunnels under the DMZ into South Korea, but tunnels have been used for millennia. As of now, there is no technological solution to tunnels. We're trying to solve it along the Gaza border by putting a barrier, a subterranean barrier in to prevent tunneling. That's easier to do along the Gaza border because it's sand. But the ultimate response in war, there's not so much a solution as a response, but the ultimate response to tunneling is going to have to be tactical. And that means being able to respond very quickly when the tunnels are being used. Assume that we're going to be surprised. And I think in war, assuming that you're going to be surprised is a good way to think about it, because the enemy is always going to surprise you on something, and be organized as best you can to respond to the surprise and not be paralyzed by it. But in what I talked about earlier, in facing Hizbullah, tunnels are certainly one of the issues that we're going to be facing. We know for a fact that Hizbullah has plans and an interest to move into Israeli territory, whether it's above ground or below ground, and take territory in order to be able to declare that they have retaken, in their terms, Palestine from the Jews. Question, do I think they'll be using a new tactic? I think there are always going to be new tactics. The history of warfare is the history of new tactics. Terrorist organizations in particular are extremely innovative. There are a number of reasons for that, but they're innovative. And it comes back to something that I just said, and that is the best way not to be surprised is to be prepared to be surprised, and not to operate in the sort of the box, the parameters that you've been used to, and to expect to see again what you've always seen. We'll see certain amount of repetition. There are certain rules of warfare that haven't changed in 3,000 years. There's no reason to assume they will now. But there's a thinking, planning, plotting enemy on the other side, and they will come up with new things. I'm going to conclude with this. We're out of time. Thanks for tuning in, and have a good evening.